Sir Desmond Stirling in The Tell-Tale Nipple, Episode 1.
So tell me, Sir Desmond, I am often asked, do you actually believe in the things you write about? By things I write about, I presume they mean the supernatural, as opposed to pretty girls and sports cars and Nazis and dashing Englishmen, all of which I not only believe in, but have surrounded myself with throughout my life. The Nazis were obviously not by choice, but giving them a jolly good hiding was something I would have lamented to miss out on. But as for the eerie, and the magical and the paranormal, not to mention the forces of darkness, the jury, composed of one man just and true, e.g. yours truly, is still out and sifting through all the evidence, unsure whether to believe the upstanding copper of scientific rationalism or the smarmy defence lawyer of myths and legends. I was having this very conversation the other night with chums at my club Aberdeen's, just off Frith Street. Don't try and find out exactly where, none of you would cut the mustard for membership. We had enjoyed a splendid supper of tripe kedgeree, followed by prune charlotte, and had settled down with brandies and cigars in the smoking chamber, a warm fire crackling in the hearth. We'd just suffered some magic tricks performed by Snotty Gove, a repugnant little oik who only clung on to membership because most people never even noticed he was there. I'd been at school with his equally oily father, who had been my fag, until an unfortunate incident which resulted in him losing a leg, which was categorically not my fault. There was no doubt that Snotty was reasonably proficient at conjuring, but his banter was tedious, and the very least he could have done was clean his fingernails when doing sleight of hand with cards. After he'd produced a jack of spades from Chinny Chapman's left nostril, it was rather forcefully suggested that Snotty put his cards away and give it a rest. Now, I'm often asked to regale my fellow members with a suitably gruesome yarn, and that evening I obliged with an old favourite about a garrotted nun who stalked an orphanage by night, auguring doom for any wretched child who glimpsed her. I'd finished my story to much appreciation. I'd so put the willies up old Chinny Chapman that he'd had to guzzle an extra tablet to cope with his palpitations. And it was then that Snotty piped up. "I say, Stirling, old bean, do you actually believe the nonsense you come up with?" I graciously ignored the word nonsense. After all, my nonsense has given me a very comfortable living indeed, not to mention many a coveted guest lot on Call My Bluff. I replied that my mind was open on the subject, that while many people whose opinion I trusted, the Duke of Kent, Uri Geller, darling Susie Quattro, were staunch in their belief in the supernatural, I personally had yet to encounter any rock-solid evidence that even that boffin Dawkins couldn't dismiss. At that moment, Scunthorpe, the waiter, a tall, cadaverous cove who'd worked at the club man and boy since the last war, maybe even the Crimean, approached and asked if our glasses needed refreshing. A redundant question. He was topping us all up when Snotty Gove asked Scunthorpe if he believed in ghosts. "I don't believe in them, sir," he replied, his curious slurring speech caused by his tongue having to keep his upper dentures from falling out. "I know they exist." "What makes you so convinced?" I asked him, intrigued. People do so fascinate me, even the lower orders. He looked down at me from his great height, watery eyes betraying a vehemence I'd never seen in them before. Or maybe I just never bothered to look at the staff properly, unless they were pretty girls. "When I was a lad," he slushed, "I saw a ghost with my very own eyes, and I've never forgotten it." So chilled was he by his own memory that he forgot to support his dentures, and they splashed into Chinny Chapman's whisky. Hurriedly, Scunthorpe fished them out and popped them back into his cavern of a mouth. Fortunately, Chinny had lost consciousness and was unaware his drink had been in contact with another chap's neshers. "Where did this encounter take place?" I asked, quite seriously. I never mock those who believe, no matter how ludicrous. Scunthorpe glanced upwards and pointed at the ceiling.
"Why, here, Sir Desmond, in the—"
He gulped, and his dentures threatened to slip down his throat.
"In the box room."
I was puzzled. I thought I knew the club's layout pretty well, but I couldn't recall a box room. "Is it that door on the top landing?" asked Snotty Gove. "One passes it on the way to the roof." In the summer I'd spent many happy afternoons on the roof terrace, sunbathing in the Buff. Had I noticed a door? Come to think of it— "Oh, yes," I said, "but I've never given it any thought. Probably presumed it was a broom cupboard, or the staff kazi."
"It's been locked these many years,"
explained Scunthorpe,
"ever since my own encounter. Will that be all, gentlemen?"
He turned to leave. "Hold your horses, Scunthorpe," I said. "You can't leave us in suspense. Tell us more. What sort of ghost was it?" He shook his head fearfully. The dentures rattled in his skull.
"I've said too much, sir. I swore to the club chairman I would never talk about it. The box-room door was firmly locked and has never been opened since. I'll be sacked if I say any more."
"Aye, harumphed. They'll sack you over my dead body, Scunthorpe, and then I'll haunt you. Come on, old thing, spill the ghostly beans." But shuddering, he bowed his head, and, tottering slightly, he left the lounge. Shortly after this, Neville Sladen Flame arrived, after an evening of rampant legovers with his mistress, allegedly the wife of an archbishop, and as he regaled us with a litany of all the dirty things she was happy to do, Scunthorpe's ghostly encounter slipped our minds. The rest of the evening passed in a merry blur, and I woke to find I'd been put to bed in my room at the club, naked except for socks. In all my years as a member, I've never found out who actually performs this chore. I presume they have a dedicated staff whose specific job is to tuck up pie-eyed members. The following evening, I dined with my daughter, Annabelle, Alison. Yes, that's right, Alison, and her ghastly husband, the wretched Darren Frognall, the self-styled Trotsky of terror, the chump who churns out very modern horror novels set on council estates, whatever they are, filled with unnecessarily descriptive eviscerations, and in which the villains are inevitably toffs or hard-working multimillionaire industrialists. For some reason, MI5 haven't banged him up yet for being a raging red, and instead he is my son-in-law. However, he keeps a good cellar, and their cook is top-notch, so I'm happy to spend the occasional evening at their bijou 6-bedroom house in Hampstead. Conversation usually gets frightfully heated, which we both enjoy, if we're honest, and my daughter has an early night while we indulge in our own personal edition of Question Time. On this evening, the conversation took a somewhat different turn. I mentioned over the foie gras what Scunthorpe had said the previous night. Frognall instantly went to his bulging bookcase and produced an old yellowing pamphlet. He said that he'd been given it by a fan at one of his book-signing appearances, and had been meaning to show it to me for ages, but our political debates always got in the way. It turns out that Abaddon's, my gentleman's club of which I have been a member as long as I can recall, wasn't always the hive of genteel and civilized behaviour it now prides itself on being. When it first opened in the mid-18th century, it actually housed a branch of the Hellfire Club, during a brief attempt to franchise that particular den of iniquity. It hosted all manner of decadent shenanigans, far removed from the refined evenings I enjoy there these days. It was opened by a rum cove called Sir Jasper de Scornley, the youngest son of the Earl of Greenford, a minor toff, who had been a great favourite at court, mainly because he was an utter weed who never rocked the boat, and was always happy to cough up a few groats to George the whichever number when required. His third son, the aforementioned Sir Jasper, was a scoundrel of the worst kind, a drinker, a fighter, an unprincipled seducer of girls, boys, and indeed anything with a pulse. If I'm honest, he sounds far more convivial company than most of the current members. Except for one thing. He liked to indulge in festivities of the supernatural. Not just seances and table-tapping, after all, who doesn't? But black masses, orgies, blood-soaked rituals, nun-on-goat action, and opium-fuelled bacchanalias. Disgraceful. I have written about these depraved activities in enough depth to know how shameful they are, however enticing they may seem at first. Eventually, Sir Jasper crossed a line, and his club was shut down. But this is where the mystery deepens. The official records of the current club only begin many years later, when it reopened as a bastion of decency for gentlemen of a certain class. What was the deed that was a step too far? What was Sir Jasper's ultimate fate? Rumours abounded that Sir Jasper's club lured many otherwise upright pillars of society into its wicked portals. Even, and I'd not say this lightly, royalty was beset with temptation. Not just foreign royals from whom one expects such beastly behaviour, but even the then Prince of Wales was ensnared into its lascivious maw. Well, this simply wouldn't do, and steps would have been taken. Was Sir Jasper popped in a sack and bundled off to some ghastly armpit of the empire, to live out his days in a drunken stupor, Johnson slowly rotting thanks to some exotic variety of the clap? And then, on the day he was finally whisked off to meet his maker, buried neath a banana tree, forgotten and unmarked. The Discornley family finally died out when the last fertile male came a cropper at Wipers during the Great War. The title was mothballed, and no freshly ennobled bloke has ever claimed it. Perhaps I could nab it when my time for ermine eventually arrives. Get a move on, your Majesty, we're neither of us getting any younger. But what did this have to do with Scunthorpe's alleged spook? At which point Darren Frognall made an extraordinary suggestion. I have very little time for my oikish son-in-law. His horror novels are boorish communist propaganda, and while Frognall may have perpetuated an image of himself as a grizzled laureate of the streets, I knew full well that he was the product of a minor public school in West London called St. Nonceslas, that he'd inherited a tidy sum from an uncle in the tobacco trade, and that he'd invested heavily in an oil well in Abu Dhabi. But his idea intrigued me. He suggested that I spend the night in the haunted room.
Sir Desmond Stirling, in The Telltale Nipple, was written and performed by Anthony Keetch.